Hello Horror Hounds. I'm going to do something a little bit different for this video, a little bit more personal, if that's alright with you. I wanted to share with you one of my formative horror memories. In fact, thinking about it, probably the earliest horror specific memory I've got is an item which means an awful lot to me. It's the Hamlyn Book of Horror, written by Daniel Farson, with illustrations by Oliver Frey. The text was published in '77. It was reproduced in a big hardback gorgeousness with illustrations by Oliver Frey and other pictures and the like. So I would have been 4 when this was published. I didn't get it when I was 4, but I vividly remember that this. I owned this. My parents would have bought this for me, and I would have been no older than 10, 11, I would say, at a push. And I distinctly remember this being one of, if not the first, specifically horror thing I owned. And I used to pore over this. The content, which we'll have a little look at, is fantastic. It's basically it's a horror primer. It's a starter kit for pretty much all things horror, and that, coupled with the phenomenal artwork on the outside and inside, just fired my imagination. I used to pore over this. I mean, I've used Oliver Frey's artwork as the thumbnail for this video, but check out this cover. There's Dracula there with, that gory blood used to fascinate me, and we've got Jack the Ripper here. Phantom of the Opera. You turn to the back page, you've got a phenomenal zombie, you've got a wolf child eating the heart straight out of the rib cage of a kill. You've got a castle here and some vampire bats. Daniel Farson, by the way, great nephew of Bram Stoker. I don't need to explain who Bram Stoker is, do I? And so if you were a kid in the late 70s, early 30s, and you were obsessed with horror, this would have been your Bible, really. I can't for the life of me remember how I got into horror or why I was drawn to it. I think I always was, I'll be honest with you. And I must have expressed it enough. I must have been vocal enough and passionate about it enough for this to have been bought for me. I mean, for crying out loud, you open it up to a picture of a severed hand on a windowsill. Bear in mind, guys, late 70s, early 80s. This is a book for kids, and it's not for the faint of heart. It starts out with some ghost stories, and one of them is a premonition of an Air Force pilot's death. And there he is. There's the premonition in all his rictus glory, with his lips pulled back, decaying, and his eye sockets empty of eyeballs. There's a few ghost stories to kick you off, and then it moves on to a section on vampires with a phenomenal picture. Christopher Lee, way before I'd seen Dracula, I saw that image with the candlesticks formed into the crucifix to ward off Dracula. As it happens, that's my favourite scene in that movie. It's phenomenal when I finally got to see it, with Peter Cushing dashing, if you remember, dashing across the long wooden table, leaping at the curtains and yanking them down to the ground. Just the best. So, but the thing is, it doesn't just talk about vampires in broad strokes. It points kids to the work of Montague Summers and his history of vampires. It gives cases of vampirism all the way up to the modern day, of vampirism. It doesn't go so far as to say that vampires are real. It's not that irresponsible, but it's teetering on a knife edge. It tells the story of Bram Stoker and Dracula, and how his mother was thought to have died during a cholera epidemic that I didn't know about. After, can you guess what's after vampires? I'm going to do it like that. Of course, it's werewolves, and my favourite page of the book. I just used to stare at this. Look at this. That's a werewolf, isn't it? Now, as I've grown older, I appreciate four-legged werewolves. American Werewolf in London, to my mind, is the greatest werewolf movie ever made. But bipedal werewolves, as you get in the Howling, they're the best werewolf form. The Howling, Dog Soldiers, they're the scariest to me. Humanoid werewolves, and it's all. I used to stare at that. I just used to stare at that for hours. It's got the French engraving that I think it's now a law has been passed that you have to include this in every single werewolf film ever made, and another etching of Hunt for a Werewolf. A glorious. We all know the fable. Do you remember the story of the huntsman that goes out and is attacked by a wolf and cuts the wolf's paw off and wraps it in a handkerchief, and when he gets home and unwraps it, it's a hand, and he recognises the ring and races upstairs, and it's his wife's. That's a fantastic story. Now imagine as a 10-year-old boy, you're reading that story with these accompanying pictures. There's the severed hand there, and then rush upstairs, and there's the wife bandaging her stump. How could I be anything other than enthralled by this? And then to just add spice to all of that, we just throw in cases of medieval France of people actually being tried and convicted of being werewolves. And as a kid, you're like, well, these are just fantasy creatures, but people who actually went on trial and admitted to being werewolves. That's crazy. It moves through to horror fiction and covers all the greats. It takes great lengths to talk about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley, to educate us really about Mary Shelley. 6 or 7 pages. Touches on the Hunchback of Notre Dame as well, and then moves on to my horror hero. No other word for it. Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. Just to my mind, and I know an awful lot of you love Stephen King, but for me, Poe is the godhead. and this book pointed me towards Poe, and there's an image from the Telltale Heart with the corpse under the floorboards. Talks about the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It doesn't talk about. It talks about the original literary sources of all of these. Acknowledges that the stories have been told and retold in movies, but points the young reader towards the original literary sources. Of course, we move on to Dracula, and there's an awful lot about Dracula in this, as you would expect. Not just because it's written by the great nephew of Bram Stoker, but just because Dracula's fucking Dracula. There's Phantom of the Opera for you guys, and beg your pardon. So as a young kid, I didn't know that Phantom of the Opera was a book. Why would I? Until you find out, until you get told. It wasn't. It was many years later that I actually read it. Many years after that I read any of the work of Sheridan Le Fanu. But here's a book aimed at kids, telling you about Sheridan Le Fanu, Ambrose Bierce, and M.R. James, possibly the greatest writer of ghost stories to ever have lived. And as any good horror education should. It points you towards the classics of the silver screen. So we've got stuff on Bela, naturally Boris Karloff, and of course Christopher Lee. Now remember, this was published in '79, so I suppose you could have fitted in Vincent Price and people like that, but it's a good starter pack. This is a good place to start. Bela, Boris, and Christopher Lee. Come on. And then it shifts in the final section of the book after going through the stories and the myths, and then it's books. They come from books. Now here are the films. It just finishes off with all the real world stuff. Talks a lot about Haiti and voodoo, the type of voodoo and zombies in something like Serpent and the Rainbow. You know, the people who are poisoned and go into sort of a catatonic state, and then they're buried, dug up and become your servants. It's got a piece on Whitby, a piece on Transylvania, a piece on Highgate Cemetery, which you can visit one half of that, but the interesting half, where they shot some Hammer films and Amicus films, you have to go on a properly organised tour of, which is really frustrating. And it just rounds everything off with, here are some awful people that actually existed. Countess Bathory, so I'm there at 10, reading about her bathing in the blood of all these maidens. Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, there's his men burning some peasants alive, and there's the obligatory woodcutting of Vlad that has to appear legally has to appear in every film that links Dracula to Vlad the Impaler. And there's a little tea time reading for a 10-year-old kid. There's Vlad eating in the Forest of Spikes. It's historical fact. It just happens to be Ivan the Terrible. Just happens to be very sensationalist. Rasputin. Rasputin. Sawney Bean and his family of Scottish cannibals. It's the first time I'd heard of them. As you would expect, there's quite a number of pages on Jack the Ripper. So, you know, the real life boogeyman. All the way up to sort of 20th century killers, and that's it. So I don't run the risk of rambling. I just wanted to share that with you. If this has been something you're at all interested in, I suppose I could do others. There are a couple of other things I could touch on. If you want to share your horror memories with me, though, this is the real purpose of it. Let me know in the comments some of your formative experiences. What got you into horror? What are some of your earliest horror memories? If you want to share, if you want to do your own horror memories, chuck them out there by all means. I don't have a copyright on this video format. That would be ridiculous. But yeah, if you liked that, let me know, and I'll happily, infrequently, perhaps talk about some of my other sort of formative and early horror experiences, and how my relationship with the genre that we all love developed. So thank you for listening.